breast cancer, she called me and my siblings, and what did we do? We immediately got on the internet. We started reading everything that we could about breast cancer. We started reading, where does the disease come from? What's the arc of the disease? We started reading about different therapies and different drugs and their side effects. We started reading about nutritional habits for cancer survivors, the whole nine. And we're like feeding her all this information, and she's asking her doctors a bunch of information, so on and so forth. And she learned everything she could about this disease that was ailing her. And after all was said and done, her dietary habits changed, her sleeping patterns changed, so much about how she conducts herself changed because she learned a lot, she experienced something, and then it changed the way that she saw the world. That's the conversation on race. The more you know, the more you have to think about it, the more you have to engage with it. And then through that engagement, you begin to start thinking about things differently and perhaps seeing things in a way that you hadn't seen before. Oh, community colors are differential racialized depending on the interest of the dominant. Oh, snap, sorry. This 3-second delay. Although I think it's really the clicker itself.
Yeah.
Communities of color are differentially racialized depending on the interest of the dominant group. Now, what does that mean? So we can look at a low-income community on the south side of Chicago. Now we know, if you're following the news, that Chicago has a massive gun violence problem. And it's real. I have a lot of students that come from the city and they talk about it very openly at the center. And it's a tough conversation to have. I have a lot of students that have had friends, multiple friends, die of gunshot wounds. Some shred. So we can talk about those colors, those communities, and we do talk about those communities in certain ways, especially depending on the kind of news that you consume. But the way that we talk about, say, for instance, an upper class black neighborhood, predominantly black neighborhood, talk about that a little bit differently. Because when we talk about the upper class black neighborhood, we can talk about particular values that we say we support in society. In other words, we make them good examples of how to be. Never mind that the folks on the south side of Chicago, most of them are not involved in that gun violence. Most of them are passive bystanders in that violence. Many of them are actively protesting and community organizing to deal with those problems in those communities, including ex-gang members. There's a brilliant documentary that I totally suggest you all watch called The Interrupters. Ex-gang members formed this organization called The Interrupters, and they literally interrupt violence that's about to pop off, using their understanding and knowledge of the community and their relationships. Older ex-gang members are referred to as OGs, original gangsters. And so the OGs can go to the young kids who are getting ready to kill one another and say, hey, y'all, you need to cut this out. Because the next thing that's going to happen is the morgue and the penitentiary. And is that where you want to go? Right? So depending on the interest of dominant groups, different communities get constructed in different ways. Finally, historical context must be considered in order to challenge policies and practices that affect people of color. I'm going to hold off on that one because I'm going to say a little bit about Brown versus Board of Education in a couple minutes. So, there are 3 key components to critical race theory: intersectionality, counterstory, and interest convergence. I'll start with counterstory. Counterstory is just a technique and a tool for analysis. They challenge the dominant narratives, and they ensure the voice of the racially marginalized is heard. And here's an example. So I grew up down in Peoria. Yeah.
So did I.
Right on. I went to Woodruff High School, by the way.
Mine's
All right. Love it when that happens. Right? It's like, hey, Peoria. Growing up in Peoria, I was always told that if I studied hard, worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and you succeed. That's a pretty popular narrative in the United States. Simply put, if you work hard, you'll succeed. Is that true? No, it's not. It's a nice motivating edict. It's a great idea. But you only need to scratch at the surface minimally to realize that that's not entirely true. So when we go back to that low-income community on the south side of Chicago, now, popularly speaking, we construct the entire neighborhood as being a bunch of welfare cheats, welfare queens, drug dealers, people that are up to no good. That's a popular construction of those communities. But in reality, and I know this not because I grew up on the south side of Chicago, because I didn't, but I taught on the south side of Chicago. And the families that I met, you want to talk about hardworking? Parents that call me because they can't come to a parent-teacher conference because they have to go to their second job in the afternoon. But those folks still struggle to survive. Now, that's a different story than what's popularly told. The whole story behind mass incarceration, a part of the reason why mass incarceration became such a huge, huge subject in the United States, wasn't because politicians started going to jails or started looking at, legal decisions. It was because people were telling their stories. And one of the, best examples of this is the documentary 13th on Netflix, which is about the loophole in the 13th Amendment that says that slavery is illegal except in cases of servitude, incarceration. And so, when folks began to tell their stories and began to tell their stories in mass, then these inequities and how these laws were being adjudicated, they became front and center. So counter story becomes really important. It becomes really important to hear what other folks have to say about any given phenomenon in any given society or in any given context. Who's got kids? Who's got multiple kids? There are counter stories abound when you have multiple children, because your children are going to see things differently. But what happens when your one child tells a story that's just completely unlike his or her other siblings, and you don't believe that child? That child gets frustrated. That child begins to feel dismissed. That child begins to feel like an outsider. That child begins to feel like, you don't even believe me. The same principle works when we expand that to society. When you have a group of people that overwhelmingly is saying, this is what's happening in our communities, and they get a deaf ear, or they get reasons why it's happening that typically have something to do with blaming them for their problems and not looking at larger systemic and institutional phenomena. So what I like to say is that, look, we're all swimming in a pool of water that was here long before any of us came around. The challenge is to learn how to live in that water and how to rethink that water. That's the challenge. Sorry. So counter stories become really important. They become ways to help policymakers, educators, and others rethink their practices so that they are in fact being equitable. And dare I say fair. Next, intersectionality. Has anybody ever heard this term, intersectionality? It's kind of like the term du jour for like multicultural education and other practices. But the way that it's popularly being used is actually not quite what the originator of the term intended it to be. Today, there's like 3 different ways that the term intersectionality is being thought about. You have the original, which I'll explain in a second. Then you have this more humanist, multicultural, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya thing. And then you have more conservative critiques and ultra-conservative critiques that kind of construct intersectionality as this ploy to get rid of white people. That's a kind of a vulgar way of saying it, but essentially that's what the literature says. So the latter 2 are kind of wrong, especially the last. Kimberly Crenshaw, that young lady right there, she coined the term in about somewhere in the 80s and 90s, and began to produce scholarship around the notion of intersectionality. And she used it initially in the context of violence against women and affirmative action policies. Basically, intersectionality explores how aspects of identity mix and collide to create experiences that are not easily identified in dominant discourses of identity. And this will make sense in a moment. She says, quote, focus on the intersections of race and gender only highlights the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. Now, all that sounds real heady, even for me. So let's put this into more practical terms. Intersectionality recognizes that in reality, apart from legal policy and practice, that race, sexuality, and gender are not mutually exclusive categories. See, previously in the law, especially after 1964 Civil Rights Act, you kind of had to choose your lane if you were bringing a case before the court. So you had to say, all right, this is a case of racial discrimination or this is a case of sexuality discrimination. Now, what Crenshaw began to see as she was examining different cases that had gone before the court is that she began to see this confusion between for black women, an intersection of identities, an intersection of race and gender. So in 1976, there was a case called DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. Now, the basic the merits of the case was that black women were getting laid off in higher numbers than their white counterparts. And so they sued, arguing that this was an intersection of both race and class. The court said, well, too bad, you can only choose one or the other. But what that did was that it left this huge hole, because General Motors was saying, well, look, man, we're totally in compliance because we're promoting black men, we're promoting women, and we are being mindful of those promotions in our processes for layoffs, because this is 1976. So Detroit was about to, they were on the front end of their downturn going into the 80s. So they were laying off thousands of people, right? And so black women are like, we're getting caught up in all this, and this is not right. Because the way that the law was written, it was not written to account for the fact that if you are black and female, you kind of got, for lack of better terms right now, 2 strikes against you. So how do you resolve that in the law? That's what critical race theory is about. And that is what intersectionality originally was about. Not just that we're all this intersection, each of us is an intersection of identities, and depending on that intersection of identity, you can experience privilege and marginalization in different ways. I mean, that's a really important and useful concept for today. But if we're talking about critical race theory, this is what they mean by intersectionality. A second case, Lamb versus the University of Hawaii, Asian women were not getting hired at the university. And so there was a lawsuit. And what they found is that there were factors in the experience of Asian women that ultimately made it more difficult for them to get hired. And so the court acknowledged that Asian women are subjected to disadvantages that are not shared by Asian men or white women. So they kind of created their own special category, not on purpose by any stretch of the imagination, but because of the ways that society functioned at the time, their unique needs and issues were not being addressed through the law. So even if they had good cases with good merit, the cases were not being determined in their favor because of the way that law was written. So there needed to be accommodations for that. The next thing is interest convergence. Now this is where it gets a little controversial. I think the other stuff is kind of easy. But interest convergence was coined by Derek Bell, who started critical race theory, and simply defined as racially progressive decisions are never made by the dominant groups, white folks in the case of the United States, unless the decision fits their own group interests. All right. How many of you have not heard of Brown versus Board of Education decision? If you haven't, I will be in the coffee shop afterwards and we can talk about it for a few minutes. So Brown versus Board, watershed moment in American history. Everybody loves Brown versus Board because Brown versus Board is constructed as our better angels coming down and saving our society. Even though, in reality, the Brown team was not asking for school desegregation. That's not what they were looking for. They were looking for access. Desegregation kind of grew out of that. Now, it's kind of complicated because, number one, of course, Brown reversed Plessy, and that's the whole separate but equal thing. Brown lawyers argued black schools were not equal to white schools, violating the 14th Amendment. And in Brown's case, what happened was she was forced to go to a school way down the road, even though she passed a white school on her way to school. And so also the Brown team, led by Thurgood Marshall, was further arguing that when you don't give the same resources to each school, then you are stratifying society. And people are not receiving an equal education, which is a violation of the 14th Amendment. But there's always a larger context going on. Much bigger context going on. So 1954, what's happening in the world in 1954? Cold War. The Russians were beating the heck out of us in propaganda. Because the Russians were out there saying, these Americans. That's a horrible Russian accent. Don't tell anybody I did that. That's on tape, oh my God.
You're screwed now.
The Russians were running across the planet telling everyone that the Americans talk about themselves being about life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, but look how they treat their black citizens. And the Russians were making ground with that. So, the other things that are going on that is definitely in the mind of the justices wasn't just equal protection under the law, it was also advancing American Cold War objectives. You can't talk about being a land of liberty when you're promoting segregation. That's a clear contradiction. Possible domestic unrest, racial unrest, as black GIs were returning from World War II, were met with continued discrimination and other problems. Southern segregation was a barrier to national economic growth. Corporations from European and Asian countries did not want to do business in the American South because they were like, I'm not going down there with all those racists. They barely probably even like me. And another example of this is affirmative action. Affirmative action is kind of tough. Everybody, I think actually a lot of people across race and ethnicity have problems with affirmative action. But one of the things that's interesting about affirmative action, and this is a theory, and I don't necessarily know exactly how I feel about it, but I was talking to a critical race theory scholar at some conference after a presentation, and we were talking about affirmative action, and he asked me, excuse me, where's my water? Sorry, I just got something in my throat. Excuse me, thank you. So we were talking about affirmative action, and he turns around and says, you know what's interesting about affirmative action? It's like, what? It's like, white people don't recognize how much they benefited from affirmative action. And I was like, ooh, well, that's kind of a controversial statement. And so first he started to talk about the de facto affirmative action that white folks have had since the beginning of the country. I was recently looking at some statistics from Harvard University. And Harvard always seems to kind of be the bellwether for these kinds of things. The Ivy League tends to typically be really progressive in their admissions policies, despite their inequities. And, you know, like somewhere like 44% of admittees into Harvard, admitted students into Harvard, are actually legacy students. And of that 44%, over 80% of those legacies are white. That's affirmative action. Now, the federal policy of affirmative action doesn't just cover race, also covers gender. And so there's an argument that folks have that goes a little something like this. And if this sounds crazy, I'm sure you're gonna look at me like I'm crazy. I'm depending on you. The argument goes that in 1965, the number of women in the workforce, especially the number of women in professional workforce, as in doctors, lawyers, school superintendents, school principals, you know, that echelon, was not necessarily what we would call high. Then after affirmative action, across the 70s and 1980s, you started to see a very precipitous rise in the number of white women primarily who were being admitted into professional degree programs, law schools, med schools, dental schools, MBA programs, et cetera, et cetera. You also began to see a precipitous rise in the number of white women who were also getting jobs in higher paying jobs, in higher title jobs in corporate America, et cetera. So what the critical race theorists turned around and said, now, how many of those white women went on, who did those white women marry?
White men.
White men, yeah.
White men. And so because of that, they ultimately combined their incomes. And that fed into the statistic that white net worth is significantly higher than any other group's net worth. So, yeah, affirmative action is a policy that has helped millions of African Americans, but it also helped millions of white women. And when those white women then got married to white men, it ultimately had a severe impact on wealth disparity in the United States. That's a critical race theory read. 5?
Sure.
Wow, time flies when you're having fun. So, what's in this? I don't even remember what all is in this presentation. These were a couple of videos that I was going to show, but I only got 4 minutes left now. So I'm not going to show them. Anyway, so to summarize all this, critical race theory is just a way of looking at law and the Constitution through a lens that, number one, first and foremost says racism is real. It's not a made-up fiction. And racism functions not just at the interpersonal level, between me and you, but more importantly, at a systemic and institutional level. It seeps into every aspect of society. And the reason it does is because the very foundation of the country was established that way and remained that way. And we can look at any institution that you want to, and I bet my bottom dollar I can tell you exactly how that particular institution has perpetuated racism. We can look at things like mass media. The most consumed. Some theorists talk about the beginning of American popular culture began with vaudeville shows. The old song and dance and on the stage and everything, long before television and radio. One of the featured acts at vaudevillian shows were performers in blackface, which was completely designed to make fun of African Americans. But it wasn't just vaudeville. It was also the print media. So popularly consumed magazines were routinely using advertisements that used negative and racist iconography of black folks. Throughout the 1800s and very deep into the 1900s. The first 25 or so years of film, Hollywood did not release any films in the 1920s that featured an African American in a powerful lead role. Arguably the first African American to be featured in a solid stature as a hero of the film was a 1954 film called Intruder in the Dust. Never seen it? It's pretty good. The first intact black family on television, intact, mother, father, kids. 1973, 74, Good Times. First middle-class black family, 1984, 85, Cosby Show. So we can look at the history of any institution and we can see these things playing out. So critical race theorists saying that the first and foremost thing that you have to understand is that racism is real and it circulates through society. That's where you have to start. After that, you're on your way. And using tools like interest convergence to recognize when policies are being passed, they're not simply out of altruism, but interests have converged. Oh, well, we can benefit from this too. Counter story, recognizing that people from different communities, their stories are just as real and valid as anyone else's and deserve to be listened to. I mean, actually, when we see urban uprisings happen, like in Baltimore a few years ago, or down in Ferguson, Missouri, or in New York or Chicago, it's because people's stories weren't being listened to. Their concerns were not being responded to. And then finally, intersectionality. Sometimes, just by who you are, I'm gonna hold right here. Just by who you are can have deleterious and inequitable effects. So, is it Q&A time? Because I love answering questions.
Well, we are going to do, I'm going to ask you to turn your mic off for just a second.
Oh, thanks everybody.
have plenty of questions, don't worry. We're going to do a bit of an experiment tonight. You know, as I said at the beginning, part of our process for putting this together was to actually get people talking a little more. And we've had now 3 incredible presentations. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Flynn.
Thank you for the invitation.
Wonderful. And what we're going to do is divide the group into 4 sections. And we're going to ask you to take your chairs, and we're going to have one in this corner, one in that corner, one back there, and one over there, with a facilitator for voices. And we will start out with a question for you. And what we're asking, we have some rules that go with this, and I will only say these are not political discussions. We're talking about core ideas about writing, implementation of the Constitution, different things that Dr. Flynn has talked about this evening. We ask that everyone be respectful, courteous, tolerant, positive, and supportive of other participants. We will follow the Vegas rule here. What happens in the groups stays in the groups. If you want to continue the ideas or talk about them further, all we ask is that you do not use names. What we're trying to do is just get into a discussion and find out what you think about some of the topics we've discovered. So having said that, I'm going to throw out one question that was proposed, and we can start there and we can move in any direction that the group would like to. The question is as we have learned this evening, that although we have this wonderful founding document, sometimes the Constitution didn't work quite the way people expected it to work for themselves. So what do you think works or what doesn't? And the division lines are going to be, Carolyn? My assistant, Carolyn, right?
Well, we wanted, the 4 corners, so you're going to be taking your chairs. Unfortunately, we have 5 rows, well, a little one. We're going to divide right here, this row, and then about Bill and Green going over.